Morning.
Good morning, everyone. For our first timers, this is CSA's third Facebook Live session. Today, we will be discussing the intersection between fair housing, realty, and zoning with our dear partner, Rafael Perez from PSAR. So Rafael will introduce himself, give some background information that will set us up for the discussion. Feel free to drop questions in the chat, and we'll be able to answer them at the end. So Rafael, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to our discussion. So let's jump right in. Give some background information on yourself. PCAR. So what is PCAR? What do you do, and what brought you to this line of work?
All right, so my name is Rafael Perez. I'm a realtor. I'm a board member at PSAR, at the Pacific Southwest Association of Realtors. And I've been in real estate 18 years. I started as a loan officer doing mortgage loans for 8 years. And then just 10 years ago, actually just had my 10-year anniversary a few days ago of becoming a full-time realtor. I switched from lending to real estate because I felt like I could better deploy the knowledge I had learned in the mortgage industry into my community as a realtor, where I could be, boots on the ground and reaching out directly to the community. So that's a little bit about me and what I do. And then PSAR, we're a realtor trade organization who represents realtors and facilitates the business of real estate for all of our members. Provides education to make sure that we have high quality professionals in our industry, and also engages and works in the community on issues pertaining to home ownership and private property rights. What brought me to this line of work is kind of an interesting story. So I remember when my parents were buying their first home. I was a kid in junior high, and I felt like their realtor wasn't doing a good job. So I got on a bicycle and started going through my neighborhood and looking for real estate signs on homes for sale, and ultimately found a sign that had fallen over, and I wrote down the phone number, gave it to the agent, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry that house isn't on the market. I don't have it on my list." And I said, "Well, here's the phone number. Why don't you call and find out?" And it turns out that it was an expired listing, but they were still motivated to sell. Family was going through a divorce, and my parents ended up buying that. I'll touch a little bit more on that later as how that experience connects to fair housing. But I think I always had an interest in real estate, and I thought I was going to be a teacher when I went to college, and I started changing my mind. So when I graduated, I decided to follow my other passion. One was for teaching and one was for real estate. So I've been in the real estate industry since the Monday after graduating from San Diego State back in 2004. So that's a little bit of how I got here.
Awesome. Congrats. And well, today you get to live out both dreams, teaching on realty.
Yep.
So you mentioned a little bit about how that your interest in realty as a young kid kind of intersected with fair housing. So let's touch a little bit about what your experience is with fair housing. So describe to us the role you hold in the NAR, more specifically the Fair Housing Committee.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, when that first experience, in real estate as the kid of a home buyer, I started noticing that sometimes it just felt like there'd be a home for sale in certain neighborhoods, and we were just kind of being told, maybe we should look down the hill, or maybe we should go look at another home, or maybe your kids would be more comfortable over there. I was in junior high, and even back then, it just sort of felt like something wasn't right. Like, well, why would I be more comfortable there, or why should we look down the hill? And I don't think my parents really questioned it. I think they kind of just trusted in their realtor to guide them. But something just didn't sit right with me, and it just, I had my doubts. I said, would this be happening if we had a different last name, or if we, came from a different neighborhood? And so I think I've always had that kind of, I've always sort of second guessed motives when things come up, just because of that experience I had when my parents bought their first home. So when I got into real estate, I always had that in the back of my head, that I was, one of the things that was important to me was to make sure that families that have historically been discriminated against had the same opportunities as everybody else. And I was definitely proactive in making sure that people, I took the time to educate people and walk them through and make sure that they understood the process and what they were getting into, because I didn't want anybody to feel like the way my family felt when they were buying their first home. So I think that's kind of what led me into the fair housing space, and real estate was really from day one. That's really what motivated me to jump into the arena as a real estate professional. So I think with that, everything I've done in my business has had that as, in on the radar as part of my business, and just kind of the way I've operated. So when I was looking at ways to get involved with the National Association of Realtors, I looked at the committees that were of interest to me, and there was a new one being started. It was called the Fair Housing Policy Committee. So I put my name on the list and applied. Fortunately, I was accepted in the inaugural year of that committee. But it was also at the same time that Newsday in Long Island, New York, had just published their 3-year expose, where they sent 27 testers to go test over almost 100 realtors in Long Island, New York. And they would send different testers in to see if they were being treated differently based on the color of their skin. Sadly, the results of those tests did show that there was discrimination. Asian Americans were being discriminated in like 29% of the cases, Hispanics in 30-something%, and African Americans were almost in the high 40s. So it was definitely not a good time for the realtor brand, because there was some real issues that were, in some cases hyper local, and in some other cases and other practices a little more widespread. And the organization had to, really be proactive in standing up for fair housing. Fair housing has been a long time pillar of the realtor organization. But with the results of this expose, it showed that clearly more needed to be done. So, but the timing of me getting on this newly formed committee and this expose coming out just happened to hit around the same time. So, what was already planned to be the Fair Housing Policy Committee was suddenly elevated to a hyper-focused committee that was super important to the leadership of the organization and what happened going forward. So with that, the Fair Housing Policy Committee was really tasked with really trying to come up with some concrete ways to make sure that at a large scale level things were being done. And I can touch on some of those things in a bit, but that's kind of what brought me into the fair housing space at NAR. It was just kind of, you can say, being in the right place at the right time, given though it was a kind of an unfortunate set of circumstances. It was also an opportunity for some significant change to happen in such a large organization.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds a little bit like you were at the, right place, right time, and it just aligned with, with not only your passion, but your interests for, seeking civil rights advocacy, policy change, legislation change. So yeah, that's all great. Thank you so much for all the work that you do. It's really important. As a fair housing advocate, it's extremely important work. So We thank you for that. And you touched a little bit on those classes that are, have been discriminated against historically. And one of those topics that comes to mind is zoning. So can you discuss a little bit about what zoning is for our viewers today?
Yeah, and I think before I go into zoning, I'll kind of paint the picture a little more with what's going on. And kind of what got us to this point. A lot of the stuff that has to do with zoning is rooted way back, right? I think our country has a history of discrimination. I think we all like to hope that we've made progress, but progress doesn't erase our past, right? So I think, historically you look back and, even, I remember back when I was a mortgage lender, there was an event that was commemorating the anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech. And I kind of did some research and dug in and realized that, Dr. King's view on housing actually included economic empowerment sort of as the third leg of the civil rights movement, right? And that creating economic opportunity was sort of that final stage in the movement he was leading that, unfortunately he wasn't around to lead. So actually that's why I see on my wall, I have a portrait of Dr. King to remind me that, economic empowerment is civil rights work, right? Creating economic opportunity is that work that creates difference in our communities. So, going back to your question, I think that, as I mentioned, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of just rooted in history and zoning. I didn't mention it earlier, but I'm also a community college instructor at Cuyamaca College. I teach real estate there, and in one of the chapters, we cover what's known as police power, and police power is the government right to impose rules and laws on private property. I mean, private property rights were at the core of the founding of this country. So it was really controversial when the government started restricting private property, what you could and couldn't do with your property. So much so that when zoning started popping up as a tool in the 1920s, government agencies were arguing that it was, reasonable exercise of their police power to create these zoning laws. And it was really controversial, so much so that it ended up at the Supreme Court. And it wasn't until 1926 that the Supreme Court ruled the zoning was constitutional. So I mean, zoning from its inception, was controversial, and many people argued that it wasn't even constitutional, and to kind of put those types of limits on people's private property. Unfortunately, the way the zoning was defined was to so that municipalities could put laws on the books that would keep nuisances and unsavory uses of property from happening. And the reality is that in many municipalities, that window of opportunity was, overshadowed by some prejudices that already existed in a lot of the people at the time. So, when we talk about zoning, it's, we can say that it's definitely just all about protecting the community and the character of our community. But I do think it's important to look at its roots and realize that in many cities and in many areas across the country, that combined with redlining and a lot of other things, really painted a broad picture of how certain communities were going to look and feel, and types of things that weren't going to be allowed for certain types of communities, or in certain communities, to keep that community from changing in ways that people weren't comfortable with. So I think that's kind of a snapshot on the history of zoning.
Thank you. So who, you talk about the communities that were affected essentially. So, so how do zoning laws, cross into the realm of fair housing, and how does that affect communities of color, for example?
Yeah, so I think, for example, As I mentioned, zoning and redlining were things that took place. And to this day, you can still see in many of our communities here in San Diego County, the impact that some of the zoning restrictions and redlining has had. To this day, you can go out into Logan Heights and have a hard time finding a bank, right? It's a bank desert. You have to go out to downtown or out all the way to the 805 before you can find a bank in many of those communities south of the 94, which also happened to be, when you look at the redlining maps, the ones that were, provided that. And oftentimes zoning was used as a tool to put the types of uses near communities of color and communities of concern, rather than other communities that people were trying not, right? So I think zoning has been used, not just to keep people out of home ownership in the past, but also putting uses that weren't necessarily compatible with residential uses in the backyards of those communities where people of color did live. So zoning is something that has impacted the landscape here in San Diego. And to this day, a lot of those communities are still dealing with the effects that a lot of these policies had on their community.
Thank you. Thank you for that background and education on, specifically for San Diego. It's really important. A lot of us don't see that, that these are still to this day, they exist. The effects essentially of the zoning and the redlining, etc. And so my question to you is, how does the work that you are doing hold realtors, accountable for, kind of diminishing these institutional ways and specifically practicing fair housing?
Yeah, I think, going back to the formation of the Fair Housing Policy Committee and going back to kind of that black eye, the negative spotlight that realtors were facing after that expose. I think the realtor organization at a large scale, at a national level, had to look inward. And some of the things that were done at the time were the president of our association went out and publicly apologized for having played a role in discrimination. If you look at a lot of the history and a lot of the discriminatory practices over the decades, going back to the 1940s, 1950s, many times it was realtor organizations that were encouraging a lot of these things that that could have been perceived as having a discriminatory impact. And I think you can't start fixing a problem until you acknowledge your role in it. And I think that was a huge step that the realtors took, in a large part due to kind of the inward look that our Fair Housing Committee did. We had to do a lot of work up front and kind of recognizing our historical flaws as an organization, coming to terms with it, and not just making an apology, but also then working to establish institutional change that would really start steering the tide of the whole organization to make sure that the discrimination, although it was already ingrained in our code of ethics that that everybody should have equal opportunity, we needed to take a deeper dive in that. So some of the things that the realtor organization did as a result of our committee's work was implemented our ACT program. So that's an acronym for accountability, culture change, and training, right? So first you need to take accountability for your actions, as the organization did, and admitted, we were wrong, we did the wrong thing, and now we want to fix it. Culture change is part of that thing, where I think historically for realtors, fair housing was one of those things that was trained on how to not get in trouble and how to not say the wrong thing and how to not do and I think the paradigm shift after this was, instead of trying not to do the wrong thing, it was proactively doing the right thing, and making sure that you're creating equal opportunity and that you're creating opportunity. So I think that was a shift in paradigm that was huge as a result of that ACT initiative. We also created a Fairhaven, which is an actual simulator that realtors can go through. And it's, it's well done. It's programmed. It almost looks like you're in, remember that old game Sim City, where you're kind of in a city and you're going through sort of a day in the life of a fictitious person. And the simulator will ask you questions. A client just walks into your office. They ask you this. These are the options. What do you tell them? And some of the stuff sounds very like, all right, I'm on the Fair Housing Policy Committee. So when I went through it, I thought, oh, I'm going to just breeze right through this. I'm super aware of everything going on and the right thing to do. And even I found some things that could have been done better, responses. So that, I think that's the idea of the Fairhaven training, that it gives realtors a simulator to put themselves through so they can see their blind spots, right? It's one of those things that you don't know what you don't know until you know that you don't know it. So Fairhaven is one of those eye-opening simulators, trainers that allows realtors to go through and realize, hey, maybe there's some things that I didn't intend to do discriminate, that they may have been perceived as discriminatory. But here's a better way that I could have done it. And the simulator kind of highlights those blind spots and allows people to realize, some unintended consequences, or in the worst case, intended consequences, and know that there's better ways of handling it, and that there is a right thing to do in that circumstance. So, there was advocacy done in the previous presidential administration. They were trying to undo the disparate impact rules that HUD had for funding, and the Realtor organization went out and really fought to get disparate impact back on the books to support the work that HUD was doing to make sure that the communities that receive federal funding were truly going out and trying to make an equitable impact in the work they were doing. And a big deal was in our code. The realtors have a code of ethics that's self-imposed, and it's really like the law of the land on how you should act as a professional. In that code, there is Article 10 that prohibits discrimination. So it's part of the code of ethics, and it's been there for a while. But prior to all this work being done, it only applied to you as a realtor in your real estate profession in a real estate transaction. So in order to be held accountable for saying something or doing something, it had to be connected to a transaction. One of the big changes, and this was really a big shift for the organization, was per the recommendations of the committee, that the organization actually changed that to allow accountability for any discrimination by a realtor, regardless of whether it was in or out of a transaction. And that was a big shift, because people prior to that could have gone out and said whatever they wanted on Facebook and said discriminatory things. As long as it wasn't in a transaction, the realtor could have done that. Now with this change, they could be held accountable. They could be stripped of the realtor title. And it really just raises the bar as to what's acceptable behavior for realtors. And so I think all that package of work is the work that's been done to create institutional change, to make sure that the fair housing is at the forefront of the organization. And it's been reflected in a lot of our national conferences and meetings, where fair housing is went from being a topic to a top priority. It's always been on the radar, but I think we're at a moment in time where realtors have really made this the issue of our time to make sure that fair housing is ingrained and trained, and that culture change is really resulting in more opportunities for people who have historically not had them.
Awesome. So you touched on ways to promote or how you guys have promoted and kind of ensured change, or specifically institutional change, systemic change within the realty community, essentially, right? So do you see any specific challenges that come out of that, of promoting and identifying the institutional change?
Yeah, I think one thing that we've realized in doing the work is, everybody has a different experience and everybody comes from different backgrounds. So for a lot of people who've never experienced discrimination, it's hard to see that there's a problem if you personally have never experienced it, right? I think if you talk to realtors that grew up in a community of color or that have a diverse background, it's not a shocker when they hear about things that may have happened or that happen out there. So I think one of the challenges is really been bringing people to that eye-opening experience and having our community and professionals, realize what a lot of other people have been dealing with for decades that they've just never been aware of. So I think one of those initial challenges is just kind of the broad scale awareness of the entire real estate community, to realize what some of their colleagues and a lot of their clients have been experiencing for a long time. So I think that one of the challenges is obviously kind of just broad understanding and a broad kind of acceptance of the problem and issues that are being remedied, but still exist and still pop up from time to time.
So educating and, making sure that people are aware that it does exist, in fact, and, it's not right, and there has to be change,
Yeah.
right? So that is actually makes a lot of sense. I went to a recent education event, and I had my CSA handout materials, and someone approached me asking me what do you do, and I explained to them what fair housing is and what we do at our agency. And this was a blonde, white, blue-eyed gentleman, looked at me like I was crazy when I said discrimination in housing. And he's like, what do you mean discrimination in, when you're renting something? And clearly, he kind of snapped back in and was kind of made it seem like he was aware of it, but I saw the look on his eyes. The first reaction was kind of like, what are you talking about? So, it's very important that people understand that it does happen, it does exist, and it needs to change. So thank you for that. Do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I would add that the same is true for zoning, right? I don't think a lot of people realize the roots of zoning. So a lot of times people will repeat rhetoric that's been used for decades, so much so that they don't realize the roots of where that came from, right? So a lot of times when people talk about zoning, one of the things that we had advocated for and did work on was, a lot of the creation of ADU policy, accessory dwelling units. And you may think, well, what does that have to do with fair housing? But a lot of those laws were on the books because people were afraid that if someone could build a dwelling unit, the people that didn't look like them or the poorer people would then have the tool that they needed to be able to get homeownership within reach. And I think that was something that I saw growing up in the Latino community that I grew up in Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is where I grew up, and it's not a very affordable city. Yet in the Latino community, it was very common for people to convert their garage or to split their house. And at the time, everyone had to do so kind of under the radar in the shadows of code enforcement. So when I saw that state law was starting to change and allow these things, to me, I saw it as an opportunity that this tool that people needed to be able to bridge that gap to home ownership and create opportunities where it didn't exist was now becoming legal. And I wanted to make sure that it was out there and people were informed and educated. So I actually wrote a grant with PSAR to the National Association of Realtors, and we worked with the city of San Diego and other nonprofits to create basically a handbook that would educate homeowners on the A to Z process of building an additional unit on their property. Because I understood that the reason that in many cases people couldn't do this is because people were afraid of what that might bring to the community. And that's why a lot of these laws were on the books. So I think going back to what we need to be careful of, when people start making the argument against, these housing types, and you hear things like, well, we need to protect the character of the community. Phrases like that have deep roots. And I don't think a lot of people are aware that what seems super innocent on the surface may have some discriminatory roots. And I think that's also just an education process, and it's controversial. And a lot of people are, it's going to be a process before, people, come to that realization. But I think as long as work's being done to make sure that these changes, create that opportunity where they were intended to create the opportunity, that they're all shifts in the right direction to create more equity in our communities.
It almost sounds like, freedom only exists where they want it to exist. It's not necessarily for everyone, even though it's supposed to be. So you touched a lot about how you guys are doing, submitting institutional change. You personally, you've done a lot for the fair housing community, realtors, minority community. So with that, I do want to, before we adjourn, I do want to give you a moment to tell us a little bit about your recent acceptance of the Fair Housing Champion Award. I believe it was 2021. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it was actually earlier this year, 2022. So the
2022.
National Association of Realtors, in partnership with some of their business partners in the community, just also thought it was important to put a spotlight on people that were out in their community making change that promotes fair housing. So they went through and kind of looked at what people were doing, and selected 4 fair housing champions, and I was had the honor and privilege of being selected as one of the 4 fair housing champions. It was great. We were able to, they had video crews come out and kind of do a mini series on each person and kind of the work that they've done in the community. And then we were able to, we had an event in Washington, D.C., right in front of the MLK Memorial, honoring the award winners and fair housing. And so, it's one of those things where you don't do the work to get recognition. And a lot of times I wouldn't have ever labeled myself a fair housing champion. I know that fair housing was important to me, and it was something that I was out doing, and it was critical and at the core of my business model. But sometimes you just put your head down and you do the work, and it's always nice to be recognized, especially on a national scale amongst your peers. So that was an honor, and definitely something I don't take lightly. It's kind of re-energized me to kind of keep doing the work and keep moving forward to try to continue to make institutional community and change, and also to just continue to fight for equity in our communities.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's great that, we understand that we don't do the work for recognition, and definitely I know that you don't either, but it's definitely not anything to take lightly. So I do want to congratulate you on that.
Thank you.
And thank you sincerely for the work that you did to deserve that award. So do you have any tips or advice for individuals looking to continue the fight?
I think that what drew me into the career as a realtor was that you know, the opportunity to help people find their first home, the opportunity to run your own business, also allows for you to have kind of a business plan that it's just not all about maximizing your bottom line, and allows you to really have a values-based business. So, you know, I would encourage all businesses out there, whether it's in housing, real estate, even you know, property management companies and landlords and anybody out there, is that, you know, it's you can be an entrepreneur, you can run a business, and also run a values-driven business that makes impact in the community. Um, you know, a mentor once told me that, you know, you can do both, right? You can be out there and be a champion for your community, and you can be out there and be an entrepreneur. And the two don't have to exist in a silo. You can do both simultaneously. You know, make a good living, make a good career, and also make a good impact in the community. So that's the tip that I would have, is that, you know, anybody in business, that you can absolutely have a prosperous, values-based business that, you know, that puts community first, and then you know, it's still based on sound business principles.
Thank you for sharing that. That's very true. Uh, Never really thought of it in that light, but you know, they can very much coexist, and that's very inspiring. So thank you for sharing to me and our viewers. Um, is there anything else that was not addressed so far, that you would like to speak on before we move on to the questions or comments in the chat?
No, just, you know, I think when it comes back to zoning and a lot of these change, some of the stuff happens at the government level. And I think I mentioned that, you know, the reason government can impose rules on private citizens is because the police power gives them the right to promote the health and safety and welfare of its citizens, right? So I think if we understand that that's where government gets its power from, the responsibility to look at the citizens, it gives us the opportunity to also question things that may be happening, or that may have been in the books for a long time, through that filter, right? Is this for the health and safety of our citizens? Is this protecting the welfare of our community? You know, and whenever it doesn't, then I think that we have that opportunity to say, well, you know, why not, right? So I think that whether we're advocating in industry or advocating to our local government, having that filter of, you know, is this for the best interest of our community? Is this promoting the health and welfare of our citizens? I think that's an important thing, an important filter to run through whenever something doesn't seem right. And if the answer is no, you know, no, maybe it's not, then I think that's where we have a responsibility to speak up. So I just kind of wanted to kind of touch on that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Definitely. That we can go ahead and see if there's any questions currently in our comments. There are none currently, so seems like you did a very good job in explaining and going in detail. So this will be posted. It will stay on our page. So if there's any questions that come across for future viewers, we could definitely address them in the comments at a later date. I want to thank you very, very much for your time, your valuable time, to the valuable work that you are doing. And it's truly inspiring. I mean it sincerely. And I say it, you know, as a member from the minority community, the civil rights community, the fair housing community. It's very important work. It's not easy. I'm sure no one told you it would be easy, and you know very well it's not easy work. But you know, for that, I want to congratulate you on the work that you're doing, the awards that you deserve and have received, and we'll be in contact moving forward. So thank you for you know, the opportunity to talk to you and for you to share your valuable information to our viewers.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would just say that, you know, Pacific Southwest Association of Realtors has just been super supportive and empowering our members and people like me to do the work. So, the spotlight and this work and the traction wouldn't have been possible without a supportive association like PSAR. So I also want to share the credit with them.
You're too humble, Rafael.
He's
Just
always
kidding.
been
That's-
that way as long as I've known him. And thank you to you, Jonathan, and CSA, because we work well together, and always appreciate whenever we need to put on a class. When you guys asked for someone to speak, like, we have the perfect person right on our board.
Yes, yes, you do. And now,
Yeah.
and I'm thankful that we do as a result. And yeah, I mean, I look forward to, having you as a guest speaker, in future presentations, seminars, workshops, hopefully. So, if that is okay with you, we're happy to have you.
You know how to get a hold of me. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Take care, guys.
Okay,
All right.
bye.